Move to the back where you belong. First class isn't for people like you.
The words sliced through the premium cabin of Delta Airlines Flight 847 like a blade through silk. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Every phone camera that wasn't already recording suddenly was. Bradley Morrison stood in the aisle, his 6-foot frame blocking the overhead compartment, his Armani suit catching the ambient lighting like armor. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from never being told no, the kind of entitlement that was born in country clubs and bred in boardrooms. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't suggesting. He was commanding, and he expected immediate compliance. The target of his demand sat in seat 1A, seemingly unbothered by the attention. Zara Thompson, 26 years old, looked up from her phone with the kind of calm that only came from having weathered much worse storms. She wore an oversized gray hoodie that had seen better days, black leggings and white sneakers that had walked through more airport terminals than most people visited in a lifetime. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, no jewelry except for a simple watch. To most eyes, she looked like a college student flying on her parents' miles. She wasn't. But Bradley Morrison didn't know that. Neither did the flight attendants hurrying down the aisle. Neither did the other passengers now openly staring and recording. All they saw was a young black woman in casual clothes sitting in a seat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a well-dressed white man demanding she move. What they didn't know was that in exactly 12 minutes, everything would change. Not just for the people on this plane, but for the entire airline industry. "Are you absolutely sure you want to continue this conversation?" Zara's voice was quiet, measured, the kind of calm that preceded either surrender or storm. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't moved from her seat. She simply looked up at Bradley with eyes that had seen this exact scenario play out in boardrooms, restaurants, and hotels from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. Bradley's laugh was sharp and incredulous. He looked around the cabin, seeking an audience for his indignation, finding eager witnesses in the form of smartphones held by passengers who sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. Sweetheart Bradley said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I don't think you understand how this works. This is a full-fare first-class ticket. I specifically reserved this seat. I'm Bradley Morrison, Senior Vice President of Meridian Capital. I fly this route 3 times a month. So why don't you collect your little backpack and head back to economy where you belong before this gets embarrassing for everyone involved?" The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Even the engine noise seemed quieter, as if the Boeing 737 itself was waiting to see what would happen next. From seat 3B, Maria Santos had already started her Instagram live. 27 viewers became 50. Then 100, then 200 as word spread through her followers that something was happening on Flight 847. Her whispered commentary was being broadcast to an audience that was growing by the second. "Y'all need to see this," she murmured into her phone. "This man just told this girl she doesn't belong in first class because of how she looks. This is happening right now on Delta Flight 847 from JFK to London." In seat 4C, Rebecca Torres, an off-duty pilot for American Airlines, recognized the situation immediately. She had been through bias training. She knew discrimination when she saw it. And she knew that what was happening in front of her was about to become a very big problem for everyone involved, especially Bradley Morrison. David Wilson, a 52-year-old marketing executive in seat 2. A shifted uncomfortably. He had witnessed situations like this before, usually in boardrooms or exclusive clubs where someone was quietly excluded because they didn't fit the expected profile. He had never spoken up before, had never been the one to rock the boat. But something about the young woman's calm dignity in the face of such blatant disrespect made his conscience stir. The flight attendants were approaching now. Carmen Rodriguez, the lead attendant for the first-class cabin, had been with Delta for 8 years. She had dealt with difficult passengers, celebrity meltdowns, and corporate executives having public breakdowns. But she had a sinking feeling that this situation was different. The way the passengers were filming the tension in the air, the growing number of people paying attention, this felt like it was about to spiral out of control. Behind her, Jake Matthews, a newer flight attendant eager to please what appeared to be an important passenger, was already preparing to side with Bradley. In his experience, the well-dressed businessman was usually the one telling the truth, and the person causing the disturbance was usually the one who needed to be managed. But neither of them knew what they were walking into. Neither of them knew that the quiet young woman in the hoodie was about to reveal something that would change not just this flight, but their careers, their company's policies, and the way the entire airline industry thought about respect and dignity. As Carmen approached her, radio crackled with a message from the gate. "Priority passenger manifest update," the voice said. "Seat 1. A flagged as VIP. Do not disturb." Carmen paused, her hand moving to her radio. She looked at the young woman in the hoodie, then at Bradley Morrison, then back at her radio. Something wasn't adding up. The counter on Maria's live stream had passed 500 viewers. Comments were flooding in from people demanding to know what was happening, who was involved, what airline this was. The hashtag Flight 847 was beginning to appear in the comments, along with calls for Delta's official account to respond. But the most important moment was still coming. Because while Bradley Morrison thought he was asserting his rightful place in the hierarchy of commercial aviation, he was actually challenging someone who didn't just fly first class. She was the reason first class existed at all. Zara Thompson sat in her seat, watching the approaching flight attendants, listening to Bradley's continued demands, feeling the weight of dozens of cameras pointed at her. She had been in this situation before in different contexts with different stakes. She had learned long ago that the most powerful response to prejudice wasn't anger or indignation. It was patience. Because she knew that in exactly 11 minutes, when the truth came out, Bradley Morrison would learn a lesson that would cost him everything. And the world would learn that quiet dignity, even in the face of public humiliation, was still the most powerful force in the universe. The plane sat at the gate engines, humming, passengers settling in for what they thought would be a routine 6-hour flight to London. None of them knew they were about to witness a moment that would be studied in business schools, referenced in congressional hearings, and remembered as the day that standing up while sitting down changed everything. "Let me explain exactly who you're talking to," Zara thought to herself as Bradley continued his demands. But she didn't say it out loud. She had learned through years of being underestimated in boardrooms full of men who looked exactly like Bradley Morrison, that revealing your power too early robbed the moment of its impact. Instead, she remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching as the situation unfolded around her like a slow-motion catastrophe that she had seen coming from miles away. Zara Thompson had been 16 years old when she first experienced what was happening now. She had walked into a high-end restaurant in Manhattan with her mother, both of them dressed nicely for a celebration dinner after Zara had won a national science competition. The hostess had looked them up and down and declared that they must be lost, that this wasn't the kind of establishment they were looking for, that perhaps they would be more comfortable somewhere else. Her mother had been furious, had demanded to speak to the manager, had made a scene that Zara found more humiliating than the original slight. That night, lying in bed in their cramped apartment in Queens, Zara had made herself a promise. She would never again be in a position where someone could tell her she didn't belong somewhere. She would earn her place at every table, in every room, in every seat. It had taken her 10 years to make good on that promise. At 26, Zara Thompson was the founder and CEO of Quantum Dynamics, a aerospace technology company that she had built from her dorm room at NYT into a $3 billion empire. The company's revolutionary aircraft safety and navigation systems were installed in over 80% of commercial aircraft worldwide. The plane they were sitting on right now, this Delta 737, was kept in the air by technology that Zara had designed, tested, and perfected. She was worth $3.2 billion, making her the youngest black female billionaire in history. Forbes had put her on the cover twice. Time magazine had named her one of the most influential people under 30. The president had personally awarded her the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. But none of that was visible to the casual observer. Zara had learned early that dressing down in public gave her a kind of freedom that her net worth couldn't buy. In a hoodie and sneakers, she could move through the world without the constant attention that came with being a public figure. She could think, create, and exist without the burden of other people's expectations. She had boarded Flight 847 after 48 straight hours of negotiations for the acquisition of a European satellite technology company. The deal, when it closed, would expand quantum dynamics into space-based navigation systems and position the company to revolutionize not just commercial aviation but space travel itself. She was exhausted, mentally drained, and looking forward to 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep in the privacy of Seat 1A. She hadn't expected to become the center of a public confrontation about who belonged where. But as she watched Bradley Morrison's performance, his assumption that his appearance trumped her reservation, his casual confidence that the system would side with him, she realized that this moment wasn't really about airplane seats. It was about something much deeper and more important. It was about the moment when quiet dignity meets loud prejudice, and the world gets to choose which side it's on. Bradley Morrison, meanwhile, was experiencing the situation very differently. To him, this wasn't about race or prejudice or assumptions. This was about order hierarchy and the natural way of things. He was a senior vice president at Meridian Capital, one of the most prestigious investment firms on Wall Street. He managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He wore suits that cost more than most people made in a month. He lived in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park and belonged to clubs that had waiting lists measured in decades. In Bradley's worldview, these visible markers of success weren't just superficial displays of wealth. They were signals, a language that communicated your place in the social and economic hierarchy. When you spoke that language fluently as Bradley did, doors opened. Reservations were honored. Upgrades were automatic. Respect was assumed. The young woman in the hoodie wasn't speaking that language. To Bradley's eyes, she looked like someone who had wandered into first class by mistake or through some kind of computer error. Her clothes suggested she couldn't afford the seat she was occupying. Her age suggested she hadn't yet earned the right to such premium treatment. And her race, though, Bradley would never have admitted this consciously triggered unconscious assumptions about who belonged in spaces like this. Bradley had grown up in Greenwich, Connecticut, the son of a hedge fund manager and a museum board member. He had attended Phillips Exeter Academy, Yale University, and Wharton Business School. His social circle consisted entirely of people who looked like him, talked like him, and shared his assumptions about how the world worked. In his experience, young black women in hoodies didn't fly first class on international flights unless there had been some kind of mistake. He was flying to London to close the largest deal of his career, a $500 million merger between a British manufacturing company and one of Meridian's portfolio companies. The successful completion of this deal would secure his promotion to managing partner, a position he had been working toward for 15 years. His adrenaline was high, his confidence was absolute, and his patience for anything that didn't go according to plan was non-existent. The irony, of course, was that the merger Bradley was flying to complete was dependent on aerospace technology patents that were owned by Quantum Dynamics. The British company's value was largely derived from contracts to manufacture components for aircraft navigation systems that Zara had invented. In a very real sense, Bradley Morrison's career advancement was dependent on the intellectual property of the young woman he was trying to force out of her seat. But Bradley didn't know that. And Zara saw no need to enlighten him. Not yet. The supporting characters in this unfolding drama each brought their own perspectives and motivations to the situation. Carmen Rodriguez had been working for Delta for 8 years, long enough to see the airline industry change dramatically. She had started as a flight attendant because she loved travel and meeting people from different backgrounds. She had stayed because she was good at managing difficult situations and helping passengers feel comfortable and respected. Carmen had experienced discrimination herself. As a young Hispanic woman in an industry that had traditionally been dominated by white employees, she had faced assumptions about her intelligence, her professionalism, and her right to authority. She had worked twice as hard as her colleagues to earn promotions and respect. She knew what it looked like when someone was being judged by their appearance rather than their qualifications. But Carmen also knew that her job security depended on keeping wealthy passengers happy. Delta's first-class customers generated a disproportionate amount of the airline's revenue, and customer satisfaction scores in premium cabins directly affected employee evaluations and bonuses. Carmen found herself caught between her conscience and her career, watching a situation unfold that she suspected was deeply wrong but didn't know how to address without risking her own professional standing. Jake Matthews, the junior flight attendant, had a different perspective entirely. At 29 years old, Jake was ambitious, eager to please, and convinced that success in customer service meant automatically siding with whoever appeared to have the most influence or authority. In his 2 years with Delta, he had learned that well-dressed business travelers could make or break a flight attendant's career with a single complaint to corporate headquarters. Jake looked at Bradley Morrison and saw everything that represented success in his industry: expensive suit, confident demeanor, familiarity with airline protocols, and the kind of casual entitlement that suggested this was someone who was used to getting his way. Jake looked at Zara and saw someone who looked out of place, who might be causing problems, who represented the kind of situation that could reflect poorly on his performance review. Jake's eagerness to please Bradley would prove to be a career-defining mistake. Maria Santos, the passenger, live streaming from seat 3B, was a 24-year-old social justice activist and PhD student at Columbia University. She had boarded Flight 847 on her way to London to present her research on digital activism at an international conference. Maria had over 50,000 followers across her social media platforms, and she had built her audience by documenting instances of discrimination and inequality in real time. Maria recognized immediately what was happening in front of her. She had seen similar situations play out in restaurants, hotels, and retail stores. She knew that these moments of casual prejudice often went unchallenged because bystanders assumed it wasn't their business or because victims chose not to make a scene. But Maria also knew that social media had changed the equation. Now, a single video could force accountability, shine light on behavior that had previously been hidden, and create consequences for actions that had previously gone unpunished. As she watched the confrontation unfold, Maria's live stream audience continued to grow. The comments were becoming increasingly animated, with viewers demanding to know more details, asking for the airline to be tagged, and sharing the stream with their own followers. Maria realized she was documenting something that was about to become much bigger than a simple seating dispute. David Wilson, the marketing executive in seat 2A, represented the vast majority of bystanders in situations like this. He could see that something uncomfortable was happening. He could sense that the young woman was being treated unfairly. He felt a growing unease about the assumptions being made and the language being used. But David had also spent his entire career avoiding conflict, staying in his lane and keeping his head down. He had witnessed discrimination before in boardrooms and client meetings, but he had always told himself it wasn't his place to intervene, that he might be misreading the situation, that getting involved would only make things worse. David was about to learn that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of participation. Rebecca Torres, the off-duty pilot, brought a unique perspective to the situation. As a Hispanic woman who had risen to captain level at a major airline, Rebecca had faced her own share of discrimination and doubt. Passengers had questioned her qualifications. Colleagues had assumed she was a flight attendant rather than a pilot, and aviation industry executives had dismissed her expertise because of her gender and ethnicity. But Rebecca had also been through extensive bias training as part of her pilot certification. She knew the signs of discrimination. She understood the legal implications of what was happening, and she recognized that the situation unfolding in front of her was exactly the kind of incident that airlines were supposed to prevent and address immediately. Rebecca found herself in the unique position of being both a passenger and an industry professional. She was off-duty, not representing her airline, but she also couldn't sit by and watch a fellow passenger be mistreated based on assumptions about race and class. As the flight attendants approached and Bradley continued his demands, each of these individuals was making choices that would define not just this moment, but their own character and future. They were about to learn that standing up for what's right isn't just about the courage to speak. It's about the wisdom to recognize when silence becomes complicity. And they were all about to discover that the quiet young woman in seat 1A was not who they thought she was. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move to accommodate this passenger," Jake Matthews said, his voice carrying the false authority of someone who had never actually been in charge of anything important. He adjusted his tie and straightened his shoulders, performing the role of decisive customer service representative for an audience of increasingly attentive passengers. Carmen Rodriguez felt her stomach drop. She had been hoping to de-escalate the situation quietly to check both passengers' boarding passes and resolve whatever misunderstanding had occurred. But Jake had just escalated the conflict by automatically assuming that Zara was the problem that needed to be solved. Jake continued his confidence growing as he mistook Zara's silence for compliance. "Sir, we apologize for any confusion. We'll have this sorted out immediately and get you settled in your proper seat." Bradley Morrison's smile was triumphant. He had known that the airline staff would see things his way once they assessed the situation properly. This was how the world worked when you knew how to navigate it correctly. Authority recognized authority. Quality respected quality. Order was maintained. Zara looked at Jake with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the encounter. She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her boarding pass, holding it up without saying a word. "Seat 1A, she said quietly. "Zara Thompson. Purchased yesterday with a confirmed reservation." Jake barely glanced at the boarding pass. "Ma'am, there seems to be some confusion about your ticket. Mr. Morrison here is a platinum member with priority seating privileges. If you could just gather your belongings, we have excellent seats available in our main cabin that would be much more appropriate." The word appropriate hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Maria Santos's live stream exploded with comments as viewers reacted to the obvious implication. Her viewer count had climbed past 1,000 and showed no signs of slowing down. This flight attendant just said, "This young woman's seat isn't appropriate for her," Maria whispered into her phone. "Y'all are witnessing some real discrimination right now. The hashtag Flight847 is in the comments. Share this everywhere." Carmen stepped forward, finally asserting her seniority. "Jake, let me handle this." She turned to Zara with a professional smile that didn't quite hide her own uncertainty. "Miss Thompson, I do apologize for any confusion. Would it be possible for me to take a look at your boarding pass and identification?" Zara handed over both documents without hesitation. Carmen examined them carefully, her trained eye noting that everything appeared to be legitimate. The boarding pass was a genuine Delta first-class ticket purchased at full fare with seat 1A clearly designated. Zara's identification matched the name on the reservation exactly. But before Carmen could announce her findings, Bradley Morrison stepped closer, his patience finally exhausted. "Look, this is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising enough that passengers throughout the first-class cabin could hear clearly. "I don't care what kind of fraudulent documents she's carrying. Use your eyes. Look at her. Look at me. Who do you think really belongs in first class on an international flight?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Bradley had finally said what he had been implying all along, stripping away any pretense that this was about boarding passes or seating procedures. This was about who looked like they deserved respect and who didn't. David Wilson shifted in his seat, his discomfort growing. He had heard similar statements in executive meetings, usually phrased more subtly but carrying the same underlying assumptions. He had always told himself that he was misunderstanding that people didn't really mean what he thought they meant. But there was no ambiguity in what Bradley had just said. Rebecca Torres pulled out her phone and began recording. As a pilot, she knew that incidents like this needed to be documented carefully if there was going to be any accountability. She also knew that her airline industry colleagues would want to see exactly how Delta handled this situation. At that moment, Marco Rivera, the gate agent, appeared at the aircraft door. He had been called aboard to assist with what had been described to him as a difficult passenger situation. Marco was 29 years old, had been with Delta for 5 years, and prided himself on being able to resolve conflicts quickly and efficiently. But Marco had been briefed by ground staff who had already made assumptions about the situation. They had told him that a passenger was refusing to move from a seat that didn't belong to her, that she was holding up the flight, and that she appeared to be causing a disturbance. Marco arrived already convinced that Zara was the problem. "Ma'am," Marco said, approaching with the kind of false friendliness that customer service representatives used when they were about to deliver bad news. "I understand there's some confusion about your seating assignment. I'm going to need you to come with me so we can resolve this at the gate." Zara looked up at Marco with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. "I have a valid ticket for this seat. I'm not confused about anything. But it seems like several of your employees are confused about how customer service is supposed to work." Marco's smile faltered slightly. He looked at Carmen, who was still holding Zara's boarding pass and identification. Carmen's expression was troubled. She had verified that Zara's documentation was legitimate, but she was caught between her junior colleague's assumptions, her senior passenger's demands, and her own growing realization that this situation was spiraling out of control. The gate agent's radio crackled with a message from ground control. "Priority passenger, manifest update," the voice said. "Seat 1, A flagged as VIP. Executive protection protocols in effect." Marco paused, his hand moving to his radio. He looked at Zara again, this time with a flicker of uncertainty. VIP protection protocols were reserved for passengers of extreme importance. Celebrities, political figures, major corporate executives, and individuals whose safety or satisfaction was considered critical to Delta's corporate interests. But before Marco could process this information fully, Captain Robert Thompson's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a brief delay due to a passenger service issue. We appreciate your patience and expect to be underway shortly." The announcement sent a ripple of tension through the cabin. Other passengers began paying closer attention to the confrontation in first class. Phones came out in economy class as word spread that something significant was happening. In the Delta Operations Center at JFK, the situation was being monitored in real time. Social media monitoring software had detected the hashtag Flight 847 beginning to trend, with videos being uploaded from multiple angles. The company's crisis management team had been activated, and executives were beginning to understand that they had a potential public relations disaster on their hands. But the information wasn't flowing quickly enough to the people who needed it most. Jake Matthews continued to assume that his job was to satisfy the well-dressed businessman. Marco Rivera was torn between conflicting information, and Carmen Rodriguez was trying to navigate a situation that seemed to grow more complex with every passing minute. Meanwhile, Bradley Morrison was becoming increasingly agitated. He had expected swift resolution once airline staff became involved. The fact that this young woman was still sitting in his seat, still defying his authority, was both incomprehensible and intolerable. "Do you people understand who I am?" Bradley demanded, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. "I'm Senior Vice President of Meridian Capital. I manage over $400 million in client assets. I fly this airline every week. My company has a corporate account worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. And you're going to let some random girl in a hoodie hold up my flight?" His words were being broadcast live to Maria's growing audience, now approaching 2,000 viewers. Comments were flooding in with increasing intensity. Viewers were demanding Delta's corporate Twitter account sharing the stream with their own followers and expressing outrage at what they were witnessing. Some viewers had begun trying to identify Bradley Morrison based on his appearance and the details he had just provided. Corporate investigations were beginning in real time as people searched LinkedIn profiles, company websites, and social media accounts. But the most significant development was happening quietly in Seat 1A, where Zara Thompson was making a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text message to her executive assistant. "It's happening again. Full documentation protocol, legal standing by." The response came back immediately confirmed. "Recording everything. Board notification sent. PR team activated." Zara Thompson was no longer just a passenger being discriminated against. She was now a billionaire CEO who had been publicly humiliated based on her race and appearance, and she had just activated the full resources of a $3 billion corporation to address the situation. But she still hadn't revealed who she was. She was waiting for the right moment, the moment when the truth would have maximum impact, when the lesson would be most clear, when the consequences would be most severe. As Jake Matthews continued to insist that she move, as Marco Rivera struggled to understand the conflicting information he was receiving as Bradley Morrison's demands became increasingly hostile. Zara sat quietly in Seat 1A and watched them all dig their own professional graves. Because in exactly 8 minutes, the truth about who was sitting in that seat would be revealed, and everyone who had chosen to side with loud prejudice over quiet dignity would discover that they had made the worst mistake of their careers. The plane sat at the gate, engines running departure delayed, while social media exploded with evidence of what was happening. Videos were being shared thousands of times per minute. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story. Corporate executives were making emergency phone calls, and Zara Thompson sat in the center of it all, calm and patient, waiting for the moment when justice would finally arrive. Maria Santos's live stream had exploded beyond anything she had ever experienced. Her usual audience of 50,000 followers had been joined by viral curiosity seekers, civil rights advocates, and people who simply couldn't look away from what was unfolding in real time. The viewer count had climbed past 5,000 and was accelerating rapidly. "This is absolutely unbelievable," Maria whispered into her phone, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They just asked this young woman to move because she doesn't look like she belongs in first class." The flight attendant literally used the word appropriate. "This is 2024, and we're watching airplane segregation happen live." The comments section of her stream had become a river of outrage, solidarity, and increasingly sophisticated detective work. Viewers were screen recording clips, sharing them across multiple platforms, and beginning to identify the people involved. Rebecca Torres had positioned her phone to capture a wide angle of the confrontation while she simultaneously posted updates to her professional pilot networks. Her followers included airline employees, aviation industry executives, and transportation regulators who understood immediately the legal and professional implications of what they were seeing. "Flight attendant just told passenger her seat isn't appropriate for her," Rebecca typed rapidly. "Delta flight 847 JFK to London. This is textbook discrimination, and they're creating a federal incident in real time." In Seat 2B, another passenger named Jennifer Walsh, a marketing coordinator for a major corporation, had opened TikTok and begun filming short clips with captions that were designed to go viral quickly. "POV. You're watching racism on an airplane and nobody is stopping it," she posted along with hashtags. Delta Airlines Flight 847 Racism Airlines Justice. The video was shared 47 times in the first minute, 200 times in the second minute, and over 1,000 times by the third minute, as TikTok's algorithm recognized that this content was generating extraordinary engagement. But the most significant documentation was happening through David Wilson, the marketing executive, who had been silently observing. David had finally overcome his usual reluctance to get involved, and had begun recording everything while simultaneously posting updates to his LinkedIn network, which included corporate executives, airline industry contacts, and media professionals. Watching a senior VP of a major investment firm publicly humiliate a young woman based on her appearance and race, David posted. Delta staff are enabling this behavior instead of stopping it. This is a corporate crisis unfolding in real time, and it's being broadcast live to thousands of people. David's post was immediately shared by several airline industry executives who understood that they were watching something that would become a case study in how not to handle discrimination complaints. The hashtag Flight 847 had begun trending nationally within 8 minutes of Maria's first live stream post. But the hashtag Delta Racism was growing even faster as users demanded corporate accountability and shared the videos across multiple platforms. In the Delta Airlines Social Media Operations Center in Atlanta, emergency protocols had been activated. The night shift social media manager, Alex Rodriguez, was frantically trying to gather information about what was happening on Flight 847 while simultaneously fielding hundreds of angry messages and tags demanding immediate response from the company. But Alex was receiving conflicting information from JFK operations. The initial reports had described a difficult passenger situation, but the social media evidence suggested something much more serious was occurring. Alex placed an emergency call to Delta's crisis communications team while simultaneously monitoring the hashtags that were exploding across every major platform. The company's social media accounts were being bombarded with demands for immediate action, threats of boycotts, and calls for federal investigation. Meanwhile, people on the internet had begun identifying Bradley Morrison through the personal details he had freely shared during his confrontation with Zara. His LinkedIn profile had been found within minutes of his disclosure that he was a senior VP at Meridian Capital. Screenshots of his profile were being shared along with the videos, creating a permanent record of his identity connected to his behavior. Meridian Capital's corporate social media accounts were suddenly flooded with thousands of angry comments and messages. The company's overnight security monitoring service began sending emergency alerts to senior executives as their brand became associated with racial discrimination and corporate entitlement. On Instagram, influencers with millions of followers were resharing Maria's live stream clips with their own commentary. The story was spreading exponentially as each platform's algorithm recognized that this content was generating extraordinary engagement rates. One influencer with 2.3 million followers posted, "This is what racism looks like in 2024. A black woman with a valid first-class ticket being told she doesn't belong there because of how she looks. The airlines, the employees, the whole process. All of it is broken. Share this everywhere." But perhaps most significantly, several verified accounts belonging to civil rights organizations, transportation advocacy groups, and government officials had begun posting about the incident. The NAACP's official account shared the video with a statement about transportation equality. The Department of Transportation's Aviation Discrimination Hotline posted information about how to file complaints about airline discrimination. Television news producers monitoring social media for breaking stories had identified Flight 847 as a developing story with national implications. News vans were being dispatched to JFK Airport. Congressional staff members were being briefed on a potential discrimination case that was unfolding in real time with extensive video evidence. Back on the plane, none of the principals in the drama fully understood how large the audience for their confrontation had become. Jake Matthews continued to pressure Zara to move, unaware that his words and actions were being broadcast to tens of thousands of people and preserved permanently in multiple video recordings. Marco Rivera was trying to balance his instructions from ground control with the growing realization that this situation was more complex than he had been led to believe. His radio continued to receive updates about VYP passenger protocols, but the conflicting information was making his job increasingly difficult. Carmen Rodriguez was experiencing a growing sense of dread as she watched more and more passengers pulling out phones to record the interaction. She could see that this situation was spiraling beyond anything that normal customer service procedures were designed to handle. But Bradley Morrison remained confident that the situation would resolve in his favor. He was accustomed to getting his way through persistence and authority. He had no idea that his behavior was being documented and shared with a global audience that was rapidly turning against him. As the social media explosion continued to grow, several key developments were happening simultaneously. Corporate executives at both Delta and Meridian Capital were receiving emergency briefings about the crisis. Federal transportation officials were being alerted to a potential discrimination case with extensive evidence, and civil rights attorneys were beginning to review the footage for potential legal action. The technological infrastructure that Bradley Morrison had assumed would support his authority, the corporate hierarchies, the customer service systems, the assumption that complaints would be handled quietly and internally, was being overwhelmed by the transparency and accountability that social media had created. Every word he had spoken, every assumption he had made, every demand he had issued was now part of a permanent record that could not be deleted, edited, or explained away. His behavior was being judged not by airline employees who might be reluctant to challenge a wealthy passenger, but by thousands of people who had no financial stake in accommodating his prejudices. And in seat 1, Azara Thompson continued to wait patiently for the moment when she would reveal exactly who Bradley Morrison had chosen to attack. She could see from her own phone that her executive team was monitoring the social media coverage, that legal proceedings were being prepared, and that corporate response protocols were being activated. But she also knew that the most powerful response to discrimination wasn't legal action or corporate policy changes. The most powerful response was the simple truth revealed at exactly the right moment to exactly the right audience. And that moment was approximately 3 minutes away. The plane remained at the gate, its departure indefinitely delayed, while the world watched and waited to see how this confrontation would resolve. Social media had transformed a private moment of discrimination into a public reckoning with accountability, and the consequences would extend far beyond a single airplane seat. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thompson speaking. We've been cleared for departure and will be beginning our taxi to the runway momentarily. Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff. The announcement sent a jolt of urgency through the first-class cabin. Bradley Morrison's face flushed with renewed determination. This was his final opportunity to resolve the situation before being trapped on a 6-hour flight with someone he believed didn't belong in his proximity. "That's it," he declared, his voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin. "Either she moves right now, or I'm calling my contacts at Delta Corporate. I know the senior VP of Customer Relations personally. This kind of incompetence doesn't happen when you know who to call." He pulled out his phone with theatrical flourish, scrolling through his contacts as if searching for a nuclear weapon. "I'm not bluffing here. One phone call from me can end careers. I suggest you handle this situation immediately." The threat hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Jake Matthews looked nervously at Carmen Rodriguez. Marco Rivera shifted uncomfortably, still trying to reconcile the conflicting information he had received about VIP passenger protocols. The other passengers watched in fascination and horror as the confrontation reached what appeared to be its climax. Zara looked up at Bradley with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. Her voice was quiet, measured, and carried a subtle undertone that only the most perceptive observers recognized as amusement. "Please do make that phone call," she said. "I'd be very interested to hear that conversation." Something in her tone gave Bradley pause. There was no fear, no anxiety, no concern about the threat he had just made. If anything, she seemed to be encouraging him to follow through on his ultimatum. But Bradley's momentum was too strong, his ego too invested in the outcome for him to recognize the warning signs. Carmen's radio crackled urgently. Priority message for lead flight attendant. Corporate emergency protocol activated for seat 1A passenger. Immediate supervisor notification required. Carmen stepped away from the group to take the call, but her voice carried back to the surrounding passengers. This is Carmen Rodriguez on Flight 847. I need clarification on the situation with Seat 1A. The response from Delta Operations was clear and urgent. Carmen, we need you to provide immediate assistance to Miss Thompson in Seat 1A. She is flagged as our highest priority VIP passenger. Whatever she needs, whatever the situation is, you are to provide full support immediately. Do not allow any disruption to her travel experience. Carmen's face went pale. She looked back at Zara, then at Bradley, then at her phone as she pulled up the passenger manifest that she should have checked more carefully at the beginning of this encounter. And there it was. Seat 1, Zara Thompson. Status 5 IP Executive. Priority level maximum. Special instructions. Discretionary service. Do not disturb unless requested. Corporate billing. Quantum Dynamics. Carmen's hands began to shake as she recognized the company name. Quantum Dynamics was one of Delta's largest corporate partners. Their CEO was someone Carmen had heard referenced in company communications as one of the most important passengers in the airline industry. Jake noticed Carmen's expression and moved closer to see what had caused such a dramatic change. As he read the passenger manifest over her shoulder, his confident demeanor crumbled entirely. But the most significant moment came when David Wilson, who had been following the social media coverage of the incident on his own phone, suddenly looked up with an expression of complete shock. "Oh my God," he said loudly enough for everyone in first class to hear. "I know who she is. You're Zara Thompson. You're the CEO of Quantum Dynamics. You're on the Forbes Billionaire list. You designed the navigation systems on this plane." The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Passengers who had been filming suddenly realized they were documenting something much more significant than they had imagined. The influencers live streaming the confrontation watched their viewer counts explode as word spread that they were broadcasting a billionaire being discriminated against in real time. Bradley Morrison stood frozen. His phone still in his hand, his mouth open, his brain struggling to process what he had just heard. Rebecca Torres, the off-duty pilot, spoke into the stunned silence. "She's right. Quantum Dynamics manufactures the safety and navigation systems for about 80% of commercial aircraft. The flight management system on this 737, the collision avoidance technology, the weather detection radar. She invented most of it. This plane is literally being kept in the air by technology that she designed." The reversal was complete and devastating. Bradley Morrison, who had spent the last 20 minutes asserting his superiority based on appearance and assumptions, was confronting the reality that he had been challenging someone whose net worth was approximately 10 times his own, whose innovations had revolutionized his industry, whose company was essential to the basic functioning of commercial aviation. But Zara still wasn't finished. She stood up slowly from her seat, her movement commanding absolute attention from everyone in the cabin. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that came from being accustomed to addressing boardrooms full of executives, congressional committees, and international forums. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her tone conversational but carrying unmistakable power. "You've spent the last 20 minutes explaining to everyone here why you think I don't belong in this seat. You've told us about your job, your company, your status with this airline, and your assumptions about who deserves respect based on how they look." The cabin was completely silent except for the sound of phones recording and the distant hum of aircraft engines. "I'd like to share something with you and everyone else who's been watching this situation unfold." I am indeed Zara Thompson, founder and CEO of Quantum Dynamics. This aircraft is currently operating on navigation and safety systems that my company designed and manufactured. Delta Airlines is one of our largest customers, purchasing approximately $40 million worth of our technology annually. And I was on my way to London to complete the acquisition of a European aerospace company that will expand our operations into satellite-based navigation systems. She paused, letting the information settle over the cabin like a heavy blanket. But more importantly, she continued, I paid for this seat. I made a reservation. I arrived on time. I followed all the rules. I was polite and respectful to everyone I encountered. And despite all of that, you decided that my appearance gave you the right to demand that I move to accommodate your assumptions about who belongs where. Bradley Morrison's face had gone from red to white to gray. His phone hung limply in his hand. His Armani suit suddenly seemed like a costume his confident demeanor revealed as hollow performance. The live stream audiences watching from thousands of locations around the world were witnessing a moment of perfect justice. The quiet young woman who had been dismissed and disrespected based on prejudice and assumptions had revealed herself to be exactly the kind of person who commanded respect in boardrooms, government offices, and international forums. Carmen Rodriguez approached Zara with the kind of deference that should have been offered from the beginning. Miss Thompson, I sincerely apologize for this entire situation. Is there anything I can do to make this right? Zara looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation, the flight attendants who had enabled the discrimination, and Bradley Morrison, who stood in the aisle looking like a man who had just realized he had made a career-ending mistake. What you can do, Zara said quietly, is ensure that this never happens to anyone else. Because the only difference between me and the last person this happened to is that I have the resources to make sure there are consequences. The power dynamic had completely reversed. Bradley Morrison, who had begun the encounter as the authority figure demanding compliance, was now the one being judged by everyone around him. The airline employees who had initially supported his position were scrambling to distance themselves from their earlier actions. The passengers who had been filming were now witnessing a masterclass in dignity triumphing over prejudice. But the most significant moment was still to come, because Zara Thompson had just revealed not only who she was, but what she was about to do in response to what had happened. And those consequences would extend far beyond Flight 847. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice came over the intercom with unusual urgency. We are returning to the gate due to a passenger service issue that requires immediate attention. We apologize for the inconvenience and will provide updates as they become available. The announcement sent a ripple of tension through both the first-class cabin and the rest of the aircraft. Passengers throughout the plane began pulling out their phones to check social media, where Flight 847 had become the top trending topic on multiple platforms. Carmen Rodriguez was speaking rapidly into her radio, her professional composure cracking under the weight of what she now understood had just occurred. We need supervisory support immediately. We have a VIP passenger who has been subjected to discrimination by both passengers and crew. This is going to require corporate-level intervention. Jake Matthews stood frozen in the aisle, his career flashing before his eyes, as he realized that his eager willingness to side with Bradley Morrison had been captured on video and broadcast to thousands of viewers. His decisions over the past 20 minutes would be reviewed by Delta executives, civil rights investigators, and potential employers for years to come. But the most immediate consequences were unfolding around Bradley Morrison himself. His phone had begun buzzing with notifications as Meridian Capital's crisis management team tried to reach him. The company's executives had been monitoring the social media coverage and understood that their senior vice president had just become the face of corporate racism in front of a global audience. Mr. Morrison, a new voice said from behind him. Marcus Webb Delta's customer relations manager had arrived at the aircraft along with 2 representatives from airport security. Sir, I need you to come with us immediately. Bradley turned, his face still showing the shock of realizing exactly who he had been challenging. "Do you understand who you're talking to? I'm a senior vice president at Meridian Capital. I'm a platinum member of this airline. I have rights." Marcus Webb's expression was professionally neutral, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. "Sir, you've been recorded on multiple live streams, making discriminatory statements to another passenger. You've created a hostile environment that has disrupted this flight and caused distress to other passengers. Airport security needs to escort you off this aircraft immediately." Bradley looked around the cabin, desperately seeking support from the airline employees who had previously seemed willing to accommodate his demands. But Carmen was now focused entirely on attending to Zara. Jake was trying to become invisible, and Marco had disappeared entirely. The other passengers watched in fascination as Bradley Morrison, who had confidently asserted his authority and privilege just minutes earlier, was now being removed from the aircraft by security personnel. "This is ridiculous," Bradley protested as he was led down the aisle. "I was just trying to claim my rightful seat. I'm the victim here. She's the one who caused this entire situation by refusing to follow reasonable instructions." His words were still being broadcast live on Maria's stream, which had now reached over 15,000 viewers. The comments section exploded with responses to his continued refusal to acknowledge what had actually occurred. But the consequences were extending far beyond Flight 847 itself. In the Meridian Capital offices in Manhattan, an emergency board meeting had been convened via conference call. The company's partners were watching their reputation collapse in real time as videos of their senior vice president's behavior spread across every major social media platform. James Harrison, Meridian's managing partner, was on the phone with the company's legal team while simultaneously monitoring the social media coverage of the incident. The decision was swift and unanimous. Within 2 hours, Bradley Morrison received a phone call that would end his career at Meridian Capital permanently. "Mr. Morrison," James said without preamble, "your employment with Meridian Capital is terminated effective immediately. Your behavior on Flight 847 is incompatible with our company values and has created liability issues that we cannot tolerate. Security will collect your access cards and personal items from your office. You are not to contact any clients, colleagues, or partners." But the consequences weren't limited to Bradley's employment. The merger deal he had been traveling to London to complete was immediately canceled by the British company, which cited concerns about Meridian's corporate culture and judgment. The deal's cancellation cost Meridian's clients approximately $50 million and triggered reviews of other business relationships. Back on Flight 847, Delta's response was equally swift and comprehensive. "Miss Thompson." Marcus Webb addressed Zara directly. "I want to personally apologize for the completely unacceptable treatment you received from our staff and the failure to immediately address Mr. Morrison's discriminatory behavior. This incident represents a fundamental failure of our training policies and values." Zara listened to his apology with the same calm attention she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. "Mr. Webb, apologies are appropriate, but what matters more is what happens next. How do you ensure this doesn't happen to the next person who doesn't have the resources I have to fight back?" Webb nodded grimly. "We're implementing immediate changes. All crew members involved in this incident will undergo mandatory retraining on discrimination prevention and customer service protocols. Our passenger service procedures are being reviewed at the corporate level to prevent this kind of situation from occurring again." But Zara wasn't finished. She had spent the last 20 minutes being publicly humiliated based on assumptions about her race and appearance. The response needed to be proportional to the harm that had been done not just to her, but to every passenger who might face similar treatment in the future. "Mr. Webb," Zara said, standing to address him directly, "I want you to understand something. This wasn't just poor customer service. This was discrimination, and it was enabled by your staff who automatically assumed that the well-dressed white man was telling the truth and the young black woman was causing problems. That's not a training issue. That's a corporate culture issue. Her words carried through the cabin and were being broadcast live to audiences around the world. Zara Thompson was transforming what had begun as personal discrimination into a public teaching moment about dignity, respect, and accountability. As for the crew members directly involved, the consequences were immediate and career-defining. Jake Matthews was suspended pending a full investigation of his handling of the situation. His eager willingness to side with Bradley Morrison without investigating the facts had been captured on video and would become part of Delta's training materials on how not to handle discrimination complaints. Marco Rivera faced disciplinary action for his failure to properly verify the passenger information he had received and for his automatic assumption that Zara was the problematic passenger. Carmen Rodriguez, who had shown some reluctance to automatically side with Bradley, was required to undergo additional training but retained her position. Her experience would become part of Delta's updated protocols for handling discrimination complaints. The social media response to Bradley's removal from the aircraft was swift and overwhelming. Bradley Morrison began trending as users celebrated the immediate consequences for his behavior. Videos of his confused and angry departure from the plane were shared millions of times within hours. But perhaps most significantly, the incident had created a precedent that would affect airline industry policies for years to come. Federal transportation officials announced that they would be reviewing the incident as part of their oversight of airline discrimination policies. Civil rights organizations used the video evidence to demonstrate the need for stronger protections for passengers facing discrimination. And Zara Thompson, who had begun the day simply wanting to sleep during her flight to London, had become the center of a national conversation about respect, dignity, and the consequences of prejudice. As Flight 847 prepared for its rescheduled departure with Bradley Morrison no longer aboard, Zara settled back into Seat 1A with a quiet satisfaction. She hadn't sought this confrontation, but she had handled it with exactly the kind of quiet strength that transformed individual moments of injustice into lasting change. The plane would eventually reach London 3 hours behind schedule. But the consequences of what had happened during those 20 minutes at JFK would continue for years to come, affecting airline policies, corporate training programs, and the experiences of countless future passengers who would travel with greater dignity because of what Zara Thompson had endured and overcome. 6 months after Flight 847, the aviation industry looked fundamentally different. The incident had become more than viral social media content or even a successful civil rights case. It had become the catalyst for comprehensive reform across multiple industries and institutions. The Thompson Protocols, as they came to be known, were first implemented by Delta Airlines within 30 days of the incident. These weren't simple sensitivity training programs or updated customer service scripts. They were comprehensive policy changes designed to address the root causes of discrimination in transportation settings. Every Delta employee from ground crew to executive leadership was required to complete bias recognition training that used actual footage from Flight 847 as a case study. The training didn't focus on abstract concepts of diversity and inclusion. Instead, it showed exactly how unconscious bias had led multiple employees to make assumptions based on appearance, how those assumptions had escalated into discrimination, and how the company's existing procedures had failed to prevent or address the problem. But Delta's changes went beyond training. The airline implemented new passenger protection protocols that required documentation and supervisor approval before any passenger could be asked to move for reasons other than safety or security. Flight attendants were given clear guidelines about when and how to verify passenger credentials, and automatic escalation procedures were established for any situation involving potential discrimination. Most significantly, Delta created a real-time reporting system that allowed passengers to immediately document discrimination incidents through the airline's mobile app. Reports were automatically forwarded to both corporate headquarters and federal transportation authorities, creating transparency and accountability that hadn't existed before. The Federal Aviation Administration took notice of Delta's proactive response and used it as the foundation for industry-wide guidelines. Within 4 months, the FAA had issued new regulations requiring all commercial airlines to implement anti-discrimination protocols similar to the Thompson Protocols. The regulations weren't suggestions or recommendations. They were mandatory requirements backed by significant financial penalties and potential loss of operating licenses for airlines that failed to prevent or properly address discrimination incidents. Congressional hearings followed, with Zara Thompson invited to testify before the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee about her experience and recommendations for legislative action. Her testimony, delivered with the same quiet authority she had shown on Flight 847, helped shape the Passenger Rights Protection Act, which expanded federal protections against discrimination in transportation settings. But the changes extended far beyond the aviation industry. The incident had been so widely documented and discussed that it became a case study in business schools, law schools, and corporate training programs across multiple industries. Meridian Capital. Bradley Morrison's former employer faced a comprehensive review of its corporate culture and hiring practices. The firm's clients had demanded answers about how someone with Morrison's attitudes had risen to senior leadership, and several major clients had terminated their relationships with the company entirely. The financial impact was severe enough to force Meridian to hire diversity and inclusion. Consultants implement comprehensive bias training for all employees and establish new protocols for client interactions. The company's reputation recovery would take years and cost millions of dollars in lost business and remediation efforts. Other financial services firms watching Meridian's struggles proactively implemented their own anti-discrimination training and policy changes. The incident had demonstrated that the reputational and financial costs of employee discrimination far outweighed the expense of prevention programs. The hospitality industry took similar action. Hotels, restaurants, and service providers recognized that the same biases that had affected airline staff could affect their own employees. Industry associations developed new training materials, policy recommendations, and best practices based on lessons learned from the Flight 847 incident. Corporate America more broadly began recognizing that discrimination incidents in the age of social media carried unprecedented risks. A single video could destroy decades of brand building, cost millions in lost revenue, and trigger regulatory scrutiny that affected entire industries. Zara Thompson found herself at the center of these changes, but she approached her role as an advocate with the same thoughtful strategy she brought to running her company. She established the Dignity in Transit Foundation, a nonprofit organization focused on preventing discrimination in transportation, hospitality, and public accommodation settings. The foundation didn't just provide legal support for discrimination victims. It worked with companies to develop proactive policies, trained employees on bias recognition and intervention, and funded research into the most effective approaches for creating inclusive environments. Zara's personal approach to advocacy reflected the same quiet strength she had demonstrated on Flight 847. She didn't seek publicity or media attention, but she used her platform as a successful CEO to create lasting change. Her speeches at industry conferences and policy forums focused on practical solutions rather than abstract principles. The technology industry, where Zara had built her career and reputation, responded to her leadership by developing new tools for documenting and addressing discrimination. Apps were created to allow real-time reporting of discriminatory behavior. Artificial intelligence systems were developed to identify bias patterns in customer service interactions, and social media platforms implemented new features for amplifying civil rights content. Educational institutions incorporated the Flight 847 incident into curricula, ranging from business ethics to civil rights law to social media studies. The incident provided a perfect case study of how individual actions could have broad social consequences, how technology could amplify both problems and solutions, and how quiet dignity could be more powerful than loud confrontation. Law schools used the incident to teach about civil rights enforcement, corporate liability, and the intersection of social media and legal accountability. Business schools examined the crisis management failures at both Delta and Meridian Capital, developing new frameworks for preventing and responding to discrimination incidents. The long-term cultural impact was perhaps most significant. The phrase "quiet strength" entered common usage as a description of effective leadership and advocacy. Zara's approach of responding to discrimination with calm dignity rather than anger or confrontation became a model for civil rights activism in the social media age. Young professionals, particularly women and minorities, found inspiration in Zara's example. She had demonstrated that competence, preparation, and quiet confidence could overcome prejudice and create lasting change. Her story became a touchstone for discussions about workplace discrimination, leadership development, and social justice advocacy. The aviation industry's transformation accelerated as other airlines recognized the competitive advantage of proactive anti-discrimination policies. Airlines began marketing their inclusive cultures and bias-free service as selling points for travelers who had witnessed the Flight 847 incident and wanted assurance that they would be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance or background. International airlines and aviation authorities studied the Thompson protocols and implemented similar policies in their own jurisdictions. The incident had demonstrated that discrimination in commercial aviation was not just an American problem, and the solutions developed in response were applicable across different cultures and legal systems. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest one. Passengers who flew after the implementation of the Thompson protocols reported feeling safer, more respected, and more confident that their concerns would be taken seriously if problems arose. The incident had created accountability mechanisms that benefited everyone who traveled regardless of their background or resources. Flight attendants and airline employees, initially resistant to additional training requirements, discovered that the new protocols actually made their jobs easier. Clear guidelines for handling difficult situations reduced stress and uncertainty, while the emphasis on treating all passengers with dignity created more positive working environments. The ripple effects continued to spread through American society and beyond. The incident had demonstrated the power of individual courage, combined with social media accountability, to create institutional change. It had shown that discrimination in the age of smartphones and live streaming carried unprecedented risks for both perpetrators and the organizations that enabled them. Most importantly, it had proven that quiet strength, patient dignity, and calm resolve could triumph over loud prejudice and entitled aggression. Zara Thompson had sat in her seat, maintained her composure, and waited for the right moment to reveal the truth. In doing so, she had not only claimed her own dignity, but had made it easier for countless others to claim theirs. 18 months later, Zara Thompson walked through the same Delta terminal at JFK Airport where her journey had begun. She was returning from the World Economic Forum in Davos, where she had delivered a keynote address about inclusive innovation and the responsibility of technology leaders to create systems that served all of humanity. She wore the same type of comfortable hoodie and sneakers that had caused so much confusion on Flight 847, but now her presence drew respectful nods from airport staff and fellow passengers who recognized her not as someone who didn't belong, but as someone who had helped make the entire process more just. The gate area for her flight to San Francisco was diverse in ways that seemed natural rather than forced. Business travelers of all backgrounds occupied the premium seating areas. Families from different cultures waited comfortably for their departures. Airport staff interacted with passengers with a level of respectful attention that had become standard since the implementation of the Thompson protocols. As Zara approached her gate, she noticed a young Hispanic woman in her early 20s sitting in the corner, typing rapidly on her laptop while occasionally glancing nervously at the first-class boarding line. The woman's clothes were neat, but not expensive. Her luggage was practical, rather than luxurious, and her whole demeanor suggested someone who wasn't entirely sure she belonged in the premium boarding area. Carmen Rodriguez, now Delta's Director of Inclusive Customer Experience, was working the gate that morning. She had built her career on the foundation of lessons learned during the Flight 847 incident, becoming one of the airline industry's leading advocates for dignified passenger treatment. Carmen noticed the same young woman and approached with the kind of genuine warmth that had replaced the performative customer service of previous years. "Miss Martinez," Carmen said, checking her tablet. "I see you're in first class today. Can I help you with anything before boarding begins?" The young woman, Sophia Martinez, looked up with surprise and gratitude. "This is actually my first time flying first class. My company upgraded me for a presentation I'm giving to investors tomorrow. I wasn't sure about the boarding procedures." Carmen smiled warmly. "Congratulations on your presentation. You'll board with Group 1 when we call it. Is there anything else I can help you with?" As Carmen walked away, Sophia felt a sense of welcome and belonging that would have been rare in the aviation industry just 2 years earlier. She didn't know the history behind Carmen's attentiveness, or the policies that ensured her comfort as a first-class passenger regardless of her appearance or background. But Zara, watching the interaction from across the gate area, understood exactly what she was witnessing. The changes that had begun with her own uncomfortable experience were now creating positive experiences for countless travelers who might otherwise have faced discrimination or uncertainty. When boarding began, Zara found herself in seat 2, directly behind Sophia Martinez, who was nervously settling into her first-class experience with obvious excitement and gratitude. As the plane lifted off from JFK, Zara looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She hadn't sought to become a civil rights advocate or social justice icon. She had simply refused to accept treatment that diminished her dignity, and that refusal had created ripples that were still spreading through society. The flight to San Francisco was smooth and unremarkable, which was exactly as it should be. Sophia Martinez enjoyed her first-class meal and wrote notes for her presentation on technology solutions for environmental sustainability. Other passengers worked, read, and rested in an environment where everyone was treated with equal respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived status. As they began their descent into San Francisco, Sophia turned to thank Zara for helping her retrieve something from the overhead compartment. In that brief conversation, Sophia mentioned that she was presenting her startup's innovations in water purification technology to investors who could help her bring clean water solutions to underserved communities around the world. Zara listened with genuine interest, recognizing in Sophia the same passionate commitment to using technology for social good that had driven her own career. She handed Sophia her business card with a quiet suggestion that Quantum Dynamics might be interested in learning more about Sophia's work. The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes, but it represented something profound. A young Latina entrepreneur who might have faced skepticism or discrimination in previous years was now being taken seriously by one of the most successful tech CEOs in the world. The conversation happened naturally, comfortably, in an environment where both women belonged without question or qualification. As passengers deplaned in San Francisco, Zara walked through the jet bridge with the same calm confidence she had maintained throughout her ordeal on Flight 847. But now that confidence was shared by travelers from all backgrounds who knew that their dignity would be respected and their presence would be welcomed. The story that had begun with discrimination and humiliation had evolved into something more powerful, a demonstration that individual courage could create institutional change, that quiet strength could overcome loud prejudice, and that demanding dignity for yourself could expand dignity for everyone. Zara's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant Sophia Martinez, just sent a follow-up email about her water purification technology. "Should I schedule a meeting?" Zara smiled as she typed back, "Yes," and see if she needs any introductions to environmental impact investors. The cycle of empowerment continued spreading from one person to another, creating opportunities and opening doors that might have remained closed in the absence of the changes sparked by a single moment of refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. Sometimes transformation begins with someone simply saying no to injustice and yes to their own worth. Zara Thompson had sat in seat 1A and refused to move, not because she was looking for a fight, but because she understood that dignity was not negotiable. In holding that line, she had created space for countless others to claim their own dignity and demand their own respect. The quiet strength that had sustained her through those difficult minutes on Flight 847 had become a movement, a standard, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen when someone simply refuses to accept less than the respect they deserve. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, if you've ever been judged by your appearance instead of your character, or if you've ever witnessed injustice and wondered whether one person can really make a difference, let Zara's story be your answer. One moment of quiet courage changed an entire industry and created a legacy that will protect travelers for generations to come. Your voice matters. Your dignity matters. And when you stand up for what's right, even when you're sitting down, you create ripples that can change the world. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice. And remember, the next time you see discrimination happening, you have the power to be the change you want to see in the world. Thank you for watching, and never forget that quiet strength can move mountains.